And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Imagine this, one of the US's most powerful economic allies, Canada, finally decides to go against its northern neighbor. After decades of close dependence, the country sets a course for independence and signs a record $214 billion trade deal, breaking onto the world stage. But how did this happen?
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
The tariffs imposed by the Trump administration were the catalyst for this global shift. The sudden blow to Canadian companies, especially in the automotive industry, led to an unexpected turn of events. The General Motors plant in Oshawa, the last Canadian car factory affected by US sanctions, was on the verge of closure. But instead of giving up, Canada took tough measures. Not only did it start looking for new trading partners, but it also convinced countries that had previously been dependent on the US to join it in a powerful trade alliance. These changes took place in just a few months, and Canada has now signed deals with major players in Asia and Latin America.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
And what about the US? The reaction was unexpectedly aggressive. In response to Canada's new trade agreements with Indonesia, which eliminated 90% of tariffs, the US economy felt a tangible blow. A sharp drop in foreign direct investment, problems with access to Canadian markets, and rising product prices have all become a reality for American companies. America, once the undisputed leader in global markets, has unexpectedly found itself playing catch-up.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
Canada, in turn, used this instability to its advantage. Thanks to its economic stability and predictability, the country became a new magnet for investors, attracting tens of billions of dollars. Direct investment in Canada grew by 9%, while in the US it fell by 28%. Key sectors such as agriculture have already felt the effects of the trade war. Retaliatory tariffs on US agricultural products have hit farmers, while Canadian producers have been able to take advantage of the situation to strengthen their position in the US market. But this is only the beginning. The conclusion of the $214 billion deal was a real breakthrough, weakening US trade relations with its historical partners. The US found itself in a situation where it had to not only fight to preserve old markets, but also look for new ways to put pressure on countries that had turned away from it. This global economic shift has become a symbol of how a small country can use trade wars to strengthen its position on the world stage. And while the US is trying to regain control, the consequences for both countries will be felt for years to come.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
What's next? How will this trade shift affect the global market, consumers, and companies trying to survive in an increasingly uncertain environment? Stay tuned for this critical event that will shape the future of both countries and the entire global market. The US tariffs on products introduced in recent years have been a real economic disaster for a number of countries, but they have had the greatest impact on Canada. The US's largest automotive giant, General Motors, has felt the sharp effects of the new trade restrictions. One of the most striking examples was the closure of the Oshawa plant, which was once an important manufacturing center for major U.S. automakers. With each new increase in tariffs on imports from Canada, U.S. companies lost profits, and their Canadian partners responded by looking for new ways to grow. The GM plant in Oshawa, a symbol of American-Canadian friendship, was on the verge of closure, and thousands of workers were out of work. This move was the catalyst for a series of reforms in Canada, which had already begun to consider new directions for strengthening its economic power. The country's government decided not to give up, and despite all the threats from the US, to take action that could radically change the trade balance on the continent. Tariffs on automotive products, which were raised to 50% in 2023, were the last straw for a number of Canadian manufacturers. In response, Canada signed trade agreements worth $214 billion, offering favorable terms to new partners willing to replace old American contracts.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
The impact of these steps was felt not only at the level of factories and production, but also across the Canadian economy as a whole. Despite the US's leading position in economic and trade matters, Canada was able to take the first step towards long-awaited independence. The US has always been Canada's largest trading partner, and for decades it has been heavily dependent on American investment and markets for its products. Approximately 75% of all Canadian exports were linked to the United States. However, the introduction of trade barriers between the countries helped Canada to seek new opportunities. In early 2024, the country began actively searching for new markets and sources of investment, while trying to strengthen its economy based on local resources. Tariffs were a tough test for Canada, but they played a key role in its economic growth. Without them, Canada might not have taken such decisive steps. The realization that its dependence on the US could at some point become fatal for Canadian companies led to the need to change its foreign trade strategy. Even more important was the realization that the country had remained in the shadow of its giant neighbor for too long. Canadian companies began to actively seek new avenues for growth. This led to the signing of a new trade deal with a number of Asian countries in early 2025, which gave Canada access to highly competitive markets. One such step was an agreement with Indonesia, which immediately gave a powerful boost to Canadian exports. The agreement eliminated 90% of tariffs, allowing Canada to strengthen its position in the Asia-Pacific region. This was a beneficial move for Indonesia, as the country increased its exports, while Canada gained a reliable partner.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The agreement with Indonesia was part of Canada's broader strategy to find new trade routes that would allow the country to avoid further dependence on the US. Canadian companies have already felt the benefits of this decision. The conclusion of lucrative trade agreements with ASEAN and Latin American countries has enabled Canada to significantly reduce its dependence on the US. By early 2024, Canada had already concluded more than 15 major trade agreements with countries that previously had no close economic ties with it. These agreements immediately brought in foreign direct investment, which in turn let Canada develop new industries and technologies that weren't available before. Now the country's economy is more balanced, and instead of just being a producer of raw materials and components for the US, Canada has become a full-fledged player on the global economic stage. Thus, it can be argued that the tariff increases imposed by the Trump administration have had an important impact on Canada's economic transformation. They have given Canada the opportunity to rethink its relationship with the US and become more independent, opening up new opportunities for trade and cooperation. Canada realized that to ensure its economic security, it needed to look beyond its traditional trading partners and seek new allies on other continents. Now, with the signing of deals worth hundreds of billions of dollars and the strengthening of ties with various countries, Canada can look to the future with confidence. After the introduction of new tariffs by the US, Canadian companies began to experience profound economic turmoil. The tightening of trade restrictions was seen as a real challenge that required an immediate response. However, instead of giving up, Canadian manufacturers and governments began to look for ways to adapt to the new reality and even benefit from these changes. One of the most important steps was taken in 2024, when Canada began actively expanding its trade ties with Asia and Latin America. This decision was a real breakthrough, allowing Canada not only to compensate for its losses but also to significantly strengthen its position on the world stage. The process of finding new partners was not as easy as it might seem at first glance. In response to tariff increases of up to 50% on key goods such as automobiles, metal, and agricultural products, Canadian companies faced fierce competition in other markets. But with each passing month, the situation became clearer. In order to survive the crisis, Canada had to reduce its dependence on the US and establish relations with new strategic partners. At this point, the Canadian government made an important decision to focus on expanding economic relations with developing countries. One of the most successful steps was the conclusion of an agreement with Indonesia, which not only opened up new opportunities for Canadian companies, but also eliminated 90% of tariffs on goods shipped from Canada to Asia. This agreement laid the foundation for further strengthening Canada's presence in Asia, especially in markets such as China and Japan.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns, tonight saying he has the right to change course.
Indonesia, in turn, was interested in deepening trade relations with Canada. In addition to providing Indonesia with much-needed investment in agriculture and industry, Canada also offered favorable conditions for the development of new technology projects. As a result of this agreement and other deals concluded during that period, Canada significantly strengthened its economic position and gained access to new markets that would have been unavailable without leaving the US sphere of influence. However, the US did not stand idly by. Realizing that their economic momentum was waning, they tried to respond to Canada's moves, but Washington's actions only reinforced the effect of the Canadian reforms. In response to the expansion of trade agreements with new countries, the US began to raise tariffs on products from developing countries, which led to a further reduction in the flow of investment into the American economy. But that was only part of the story. The reaction of Canadian companies themselves to the new trade conditions was mixed. Despite threats from the US, Canadian companies continued to operate and seek new opportunities for development. This was particularly evident in the automotive industry, where Canadian manufacturers began active cooperation with Asian partners, such as Hyundai and Toyota. One of the largest projects was the launch of a joint venture with Japanese partners, which led to the creation of new high-tech car models that successfully competed with their American counterparts. This not only helped the Canadian economy strengthen its position in the domestic market, but also opened up new prospects for exports to Asia and Europe.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
However, despite successes in some industries, other sectors of the economy faced serious problems. Agriculture, which had traditionally been an important part of Canadian exports to the US, was under threat. Retaliatory tariffs imposed by the US on Canadian products dealt a serious blow to Canadian farmers, especially in the western provinces, where agriculture was the main source of income. As a result, farmers began to look for new ways to sell their products in other markets, especially in Europe and Asia. It was to these markets that Canada began to increase its exports, gradually restoring balance in agriculture. At this time, new trade agreements with the European Union came to the rescue, allowing Canadian farmers to overcome the difficulties associated with restrictions on the US market. Meanwhile, the US began to realize that the retaliatory measures were not producing the desired results. With each passing month, tariffs on Canadian goods only increased the economic pressure on American companies, especially car manufacturers and agricultural firms. By the summer of 2025, it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. At this time, Canada signed a major agreement with Indonesia, which allowed it to significantly strengthen its position in Asia and greatly reduce its economic dependence on the US. This agreement was a landmark moment that marked a new phase in relations between the two countries.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
After the conclusion of this agreement, Canada became an important player in the global market, and its role in the global economy only grew stronger. However, despite its successes, the economic confrontation with the US continued. Tariffs remained high, and American companies continued to look for ways to circumvent these restrictions. Amid this global economic pressure, Canada demonstrated its ability to adapt and change, gaining the opportunity to stabilize its economy and expand its influence on the international stage. Meanwhile, the US continued to look for ways to regain its lost position, but Canada's influence on the world market had already become tangible and inevitable. When the trade war between the US and Canada entered its decisive phase, the consequences for both countries' economies became clear. The serious blow to American manufacturers raised questions about the long-term consequences for the entire region. While the US tried to strengthen its economy by putting pressure on Canada, Canada, in turn, began to look for ways to strengthen its position on the global stage. The $214 billion agreement that was signed turned out to be not just a response to US trade tariffs, but a real strategic victory. This agreement was a landmark moment for the Canadian economy, which was rapidly moving towards greater independence from the US. The United States' response to this agreement was predictable: higher tariffs on Canadian products and increased economic pressure. However, instead of delivering a crushing blow, these measures only strengthened Canada's position on the international stage. First and foremost, the conclusion of agreements with Asia and Latin America gave Canada access to new markets and significantly expanded its export horizons. One of the most important steps was Canada's greater integration into global trade chains, which allowed the country to reduce its dependence on the US and begin to establish more advantageous partnerships with new players on the world stage. Unsurprisingly, the global impact of this agreement has been tangible. Canada has not only strengthened its position in Asia and Latin America, but has also significantly enhanced its attractiveness to foreign investors. In turn, the US began to realize that the sanctions it had imposed on Canada not only failed to produce the desired result, but also backfired. Investors, disappointed by political instability, began to withdraw funds from US assets en masse and invest them in more stable Canadian projects. This led to a sharp increase in foreign direct investment in Canada by 9%, while the US suffered losses, recording a 28% drop compared to previous years. But while Canada began to reap the rewards of its strategy, the US faced the severe consequences of its tariff wars. Agriculture, which has always been one of the key sectors of the US economy, found itself in a very difficult situation. Canada's retaliatory measures made it difficult for U.S. agricultural products to enter the Canadian market, causing a sharp decline in shipments. Farmers in the U.S. began to complain about rising costs and declining profits. Canadian agricultural producers, on the other hand, benefited from less pressure from U.S. tariffs and actively expanded exports to Asia and Europe. The situation for small businesses in both countries also changed. Small and medium-sized enterprises in the U.S. began to face rising costs, which put them in an extremely vulnerable position. Many companies, especially in the automotive and agricultural sectors, began to look for new markets for their products to offset the losses from tariffs. Some entrepreneurs decided to relocate their production to Canada, where business conditions had become much more favorable. This led to rapid growth in small and medium-sized businesses in Canada, giving the country an additional boost for further development.